having looked at the files section, we have to switch to the domains for now. Now, just like I shared that the domain is always a user-friendly name that points to our. So now with the domains tool, it has a number of sub-other tools like WordPress management, site publisher, etc. So with the domains as a beginner, the most important tool at this point of time that you need to know is the domains tool. So this tool, we always use it to manage our domains that we are going to be working with. So if I come back here and update the domains, you have to understand that one, by default, whenever we do have a cPanel, we always have the primary domain. So the primary domain is always the unique domain that you go ahead and buy So for example, if you're trying to build maybe an e-commerce app and you went ahead and bought maybe, for example, like let's actually use one of jumia.com. So jumia.com is the domain and it is always the main domain, or we also refer to it as the primary domain. So at this point of time, we see that the one I'm using is this much, testbz.com. And of course, whenever for example, if I open it up, this is what you are seeing apparently. And the primary domain is always created in that it points to, most of the time, it points to the public HTML folder. So it has a document root, and this points to the root folder for this domain, and at this point of time it is the public HTML. So when I click on this, it's of course going to redirect us to the public HTML folder contents, and the public HTML folder is always the directory where we host. So the public HTML folder is always the directory where you store all the files that make up your site, so that we make them up. So the public HTML folder is always the directory where you store all your files that make up your website, making them accessible to the public through your domain. So the public HTML is always the root directory for your website's content, meaning that for anything that you place in this folder, it can always be accessed via the internet using your domain. So when I go back to the domains, you see that with the domains, you can always enforce the redirects, and you can also force HTTPS redirects too. But most importantly, as a beginner, at this point of time, having gotten insights on the primary domain, you must understand how we create subdomains. Now, why do we really need subdomains and primary domains? So these do come in for cases whereby, one, most of the times when you're, for example, building your back end and the front end projects, in terms of domains, we always ensure that the front end points to the primary domain. So contents of the front end, for example, if it is a React app, all the contents of the front end are going to be created in that they point to the primary domain. And then for the subdomains, which is a domain that is built on top of your primary domain, this will be pointing to the back end. So why is this the case? Because most of the times, if for example it's going to be a website, you want to ensure that when you host your website files, the first landing page, for example, if it is something like jumia.com as the domain, so we believe that this is the primary domain, and we expect that if we are working with a primary domain, the moment we access such a landing page or a web page for jumia.com, for example, we must be able to see the landing page or the welcome page. So on the other hand, with the back end, we believe that maybe at some point of time you have an API, and maybe you wanted to ensure that the API is hosted differently, in that the API is going to maybe, for example, if initially we had jumia.com, this is going to be rendering or returning the contents of the website, and by default we access the contents of the, for example, the landing page. And on the back end, if we do have something like an API, and maybe the API and also maybe an admin dashboard, that means that now for us to access that kind of content, we could have something like a subdomain like admin dot maybe jumia.com. So anything for the backend like the API could now be followed up with something like slash maybe API slash version 1. But keeping in mind that the admin.jumia.com now becomes the subdomain, while jumia.com becomes the primary domain. So these come in for cases whereby the backend has been created in, for example, a language like and this comes in, for example, for cases whereby the front end was created in a different framework, like, for example, React, JavaScript, and maybe the back end has an API, and maybe the API has been built using Python or maybe Laravel. So for this case, you realize that both the back end and the front end would be hosted on different domains. And this will introduce us to the cause later on. So the question is, how do we create subdomains? Now, to create a subdomain, you always click on create new domain. This is now going to cater for the back end, for example. So you see that the default placeholder is always myexample.com. So if we are going to create a subdomain comes from the primary domain. So the subdomain syntax is very easy in that you always come up with the name that you're going to use for the subdomain, then dot the primary domain. And of course, domains do not have space, so I will keep this like this. So for example, just like we have this one of admin.jumia.com, and at this point we could believe that now Jumia would be having something like an admin dashboard too, and also an API. But if it is only an API, you could go for something like api.jumia.com, something like this. So you see that the API is the name that we are passing, following up with a prefix for the subdomain. And then the .com is our domain. So the first value for the subdomain is always user defined. So it can vary depending on what exactly you want and also on how you want to group your website content. So with that shared, I will create a simple one here. So for example, if I'm going to be deploying a front-end project in React and a back-end project that has been built using Python Flask, then that means that I believe that I could be having an API in Python Flask and also a simple dashboard. So my subdomain for the backend would be admin dot. We follow this up with the domain name. So you see that most of the times you wouldn't be sure of the domain name, or sometimes you could really know it and maybe type it poorly. So the best thing to do is for you to just copy the domain name here, for example, and after the full stop, you go ahead and paste the domain name. So you see that once the syntax is really valid, we are going to have the validation error removed. The domain is required, and if I type anything like this, for example, we go ahead and see that the domain must include at least 2 labels. So I'll go ahead and paste my subdomain. Whenever you're creating a domain, you must go ahead and create the document root where the contents of that domain are going to be stored. So for most of the primary domains, the contents of that domain would be stored in the public HTML. So at some point, maybe you would want to share the same folder. And if you're not really interested in this, you can always customize the folder here. In that, instead of maybe having the document root as maybe admin.test blah 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 this much, you can go ahead and pass in a folder in here that already exists in the file manager. So for example, you notice that we did have the demo, right? But you can choose to, for example, have the document root as public HTML/demo, or maybe store it inside the home folder if there is any other folder in here. So if, for example, we need to create it in here, you just go ahead and, for example, have something like backend, just precisely. Then you say create, and this is the folder. So if you wanted to customize the value, you could come back here and pass in a value for backend, then you say submit. And also keeping in mind that when you're creating a domain, it takes some time, and having created the domain, having created the subdomain, you can always make updates. For example, if I notice that maybe I wanted to update the document root, I could come back here to manage, and instead of again working with the document root as backend, maybe we can still stick to, first do a Ctrl Z, we can still stick to what is being defined here by copying it up and, for example, pasting it here. Then you click on update. So you also have the ability of deleting domains, just like here. You can always click on remove the domain and it will go ahead and delete the domain. So with that shared, you always have the ability of returning to the domains by clicking on return to domains. And you see that at this point of time, the document root has been updated, meaning that contents of this subdomain would be maybe be stored in here, or if there is any customization, then we can always update based on how we want to store the files.